Everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. So this is the latest in our Solutions to Pellet Pollution series. And today's webinar is titled Plastic Pellets and the Global Plastics Treaty, Key Insights Ahead of INC 5.2. So today's presentations will be covering topics including why the Global Plastics Treaty is a major opportunity to address global pellet pollution, how the plastic pellets and microplastics can be addressed in the treaty text, what to expect at INC 5.2, and a lot more. So again, just some quick housekeeping bits. Please ensure cameras and mics are kept off. Put any questions that you have in the chat. We'll come to them at the Q&A at the end. And again, this webinar is being recorded and will be available afterwards on the Vidri YouTube channel. So we've got an interesting lineup of speakers today. I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Jamie Clarkson. I'm a project officer at the Scottish environmental charity FIDRA, and I work on the Great Nurdle Hunt project. And the Great Nurdle Hunt project is a global citizen science project which collects evidence and data of pellet pollution from around the world, which can then be used to demonstrate the scale of pollution to the industries and government and show people care and want to see change. We're also thrilled to be joined by a guest lineup today with speakers including Falco Martin from Fauna and Flora. Falco is the Programme Officer at the Marine Plastics at the International Wildlife Conservation Organisation Fauna and Flora. Falco is a marine biologist by formation, and currently supports the team's global and policy work with particular focus on microplastics, as well as providing technical support for Fauna and Flora's regional teams and partners around the world. In recent months, Falco has also been following different pellet policy developments, such as those from the International Maritime Organization, the European Commission, and the UN Global Plastics Treaty. Also joined by Amy Youngman from EIA. Amy is a California-barred international environmental attorney based in the Netherlands who joined Environmental Investigation Agency as a legal and policy specialist. Amy has prior experience in other areas of international environmental policy, climate change litigation, ocean conservation, but her current role focuses on the Global Plastics Treaty with complementary plastics policy work at the IMO, Basel Convention, and in the EU. And we're also joined today by Dharmesh Shah, an independent policy expert. Dharmesh is an Indian-based environmental policy analyst, researcher, and writer. He works independently and as an affiliate to several national and international organizations on biodiversity, air pollution, chemicals, and toxic hazardous waste, plastic pollution, and environmental health. A quick run through of today's agenda. I'll be starting us off with just a quick overview of the pellet pollution issue and why action to address plastic pellet pollution matters. I'll then be handing over to Dharmesh, who will be giving us an update on the MSC ELSA 3 spill, which has been impacting India, and what to expect at INC 5.2. We'll then hand on to Amy, who will be taking us through why the UN Global Plastics Treaty is a major opportunity. Then we'll be hearing from Falco as he goes over plastic pellets and microplastics in the treaty text itself. We'll be then sharing and highlighting some useful resources for work on the Global Plastics Treaty and plastic pellets before going into a Q&A session and then bringing things to a close. So today's webinar will be approximately 1 hour long. So with that, I will kick things off. So as said, my name is Jamie Clarkson. I'm a project officer at FIDRA, a Scottish-based environmental charity, and I work on our Great Nurdle Hunt project. And I'll be taking us through what plastic pellets are and why international action matters. So for those of you unfamiliar with plastic pellets are microplastics that are approximately the size of a lentil and the industrial feedstock used to make almost all plastic products from plastic bottles to washing machine parts. And they are a major source of upstream plastic pollution. They can be made from virgin, recycled, and bioplastics. So how do plastic pellets enter the environment? Plastics spill into the environment throughout the global plastic supply chain. This occurs during production, transportation, handling, conversion into plastic products, recycling, and waste processing stages. This is mainly a result of poor handling and mismanagement of pellets throughout the supply chain. Each year, over 445,000 tons of plastic pellets spill into the environment globally. Plastic pellets Plastic pellets represent the second largest source of primary microplastic pollution globally. But as you can also see from this map, even nations who do not produce plastic pellets are at risk of pellet pollution due to the extensive supply chain networks which covers the globe. So really nowhere is safe from pellet pollution. Once in the environment, plastic pellets are highly mobile and difficult to remove. Animals can mistake pellets as food, ingesting them, causing them to starve and suffer organ damage, while also transferring microplastics and harmful chemicals into the food chain. As pellets break down in the environment, they release smaller fragments of plastics, which can also enter into food chains, human and animal tissues, and disrupt their function. Pellets are also made of a number of chemicals which over time leach out into the environment and have been linked to human and animal health impacts. While harmful chemicals, bacteria, and pathogens in the environment can accumulate on the surface of plastic pellets, creating a toxic cocktail on their surface. Spills can also have major impacts to communities and local economies, particularly, for example, fishing and tourism industries. And the evidence of this has been seen over recent months following the spill in Kerala. So why does action on plastic pellets matter? Plastic pellet pollution is a global issue. The Great Global Nurdle Hunt has helped to map pellet pollution around the world from Canada to Kenya, from Spain to Sri Lanka. The global plastic supply chain is a global network and requires a global response to address this major source of plastic pollution. Government and industry efforts to address pellet pollution have been ineffective in addressing the issue. This can be seen by the continued pellet pollution spills that we keep seeing to this day. This is often due to the fact that efforts have focused on only a small section of the global supply chain or have been voluntary. However, plastic pellet pollution is preventable. 95% of plastic pellet pollution could be prevented through mandatory best practice measures implemented throughout the supply chain. The Global Plastics Treaty presents a major opportunity to address this global pollution issue. So what has happened since the last round of negotiations at INC5? There's been some big developments in relation to plastic pellets. A big one of this has been in the European Union. New regulation to prevent some sources of pellet loss in the European Union region has been adopted in April 2025. Now, this sets an important precedent for regulatory action to address pellet pollution. We also saw at UNOC in June 2025, over 90 nations signed the Nice Declaration for an Ambitious Plastics Treaty ahead of INC 5.2, really signaling the ambition for an ambitious treaty. And devastatingly, though, we have seen two more major spills at sea, one in the North Sea and one in the Arabian Sea, and both of these have been major incidents and just go to show these are the latest in a long line of such spills. As said, in March 2025, millions of pellets were released into the environment following a collision between two ships off England's east coast. This, soon after the collision, melted clumps of plastic pellets, as well as individual pellets, soon began to wash up on the shoreline of East England. These have impacted a large area, particularly the international important wetland area known as the Wash, and these have spread far from the original source of the pollution of the spill. So far, cleanup efforts have removed over 10,000 kilograms of plastic pellets, but more continue to wash up. Then, only 2 months after the North Sea spill, in May 2025, the sinking of the container ship MS3 Elsa in the Arabian Sea resulted in the release of millions of pellets into the environment, with major impacts to India's coastline and beyond. We'll hear a lot more about this from our other speakers. But again, these spills are just the latest in a long line of such disasters, highlighting once again the urgent need for international action to address and prevent pellet pollution throughout the global supply chain. If you'd like to find out more about the Great Nurdle Hunt, you can find it on our website, our information hub, and also following us on YouTube and social media. So with that, I will now hand over to Dharmesh, who will take us through some updates on the MS3 MSC ELSA 3 spill and what to expect at INC 5.2.
Today. So thank you so much, Jamie, for the introduction. And so I'm making this presentation as a independent public policy analyst. I've been following a lot of environmental issues in India, and of course, this is something that's happened in my backyard. I don't live on the coast. I live in Kerala, but I live on the hills of the Western Ghats, much away, far away from where the actual spill has happened. But I've been following this bill quite closely, looking at these policy response and looking at how the government has and the legal battle between the company and the government, which is ongoing right now. So I'm just going to run you through the current status of the disaster and where we're at and how the government has responded and what is happening on the ground, so to speak. So next slide, please. So just to give you a bit of a background, the actual disaster took place on the 25th of May. I don't know if you can see the full slide, but it's a bit cut off from me. But if you this is a Liberian flagged container ship, the MSC ELSA 3, and this capsized and sank off the coast of Kerala in somewhere near the city of Kochi, which is one of the major metropolises in the country. And this was operated by MSC is basically Mediterranean Shipping Company. That's the name of the company, and it was en route from one of the biggest port in the country, the Viranjam port in Kerala, and it carried like around 643 containers. And I just got a chance to see the manifest last week, so we have an exact count of the number of containers that were on board. Luckily, the crew members and all the staff that was on board the ship was rescued by the Indian Coast Guard and Navy, and before the ship went under. The map that you see on the screen, that's the exact location where the disaster happened. It was 38 nautical miles from the coast. So next slide, please. So these are some of the images from the actual aftermath of disaster, and the ship's manifest, which was initially not publicly disclosed, was later revealed under a court order for transparency. And I spent a few hours earlier this week looking at it, and it showed that the ship was carrying significant quantities of fuel and hazardous material, in addition to general cargo. There was a lot of furnace oil, diesel oil. Luckily, we did not have a widespread oil disaster because a lot of quick response from the government, and a lot of the oil slick and initial leak was contained and sealed. So we don't have a major oil disaster at hand. There were 72 containers of plastic carrying plastic polymers, and and when I did a tally yesterday, and it comes up to about 2,040 metric tons. It also contained a dozen containers of calcium carbide, about 340 metric tons, and then there was also polymer powder. There were a couple of containers of polymer powder. And then there was a whole bunch of other things like waste paper scrap, one container just labeled waste. And then there were chemicals that were used in manufacturing of plastic. There were several containers of hydrazine. Then there was bleached paper pulp, several hundred containers of surfactants used in the cosmetic industry, and then several hundred containers of quicklime and slake lime. Now, the pellet disaster, of course, is a major concern at this point, and which is a visible pollution. But a lot of these other chemicals have probably just disappeared in the water. Looking at just the hydrogen, the calcium carbide and the quicklime, slake lime, both these are extremely toxic and caustic substances, and they are known to alter the pH of the water. So we don't even know what is happening to the water ecosystem in that region. At this point, it probably created a dead zone. We don't know. No assessment has been done yet because the sea is very rough at this point because it's monsoons. So at this point, all this stuff is in the water, and it remains a major environmental hazard and environmental concern. So while we talk about the pellets, I think I just wanted to kind of also bring that fact, talk about that fact, that other chemicals also in the ship. On the cleanup, we had in total about 100 containers were initially reported to have washed ashore across the Kerala coast. And as I said, there was no like large scale oil slick, but the toxic substances are a major concern. And I'm hoping that there is deeper investigation into that in going forward. Regarding the cleanup efforts of the pellets, so far about 600 tons of noodles have been cleaned up approximately, and these are from different regions of the coast, from different districts of Kerala and Tamil Nadu, the neighboring state of Tamil Nadu. So there's a slide later which I can show you the extent of the disaster. But in total, there about an estimate says that about 71,000 sacks of pellets, and of this, only 7,920 sacks have been pellet bags have been recovered, which are the full pellet bags which you see in the screen there, which is the ones that are not spilled out. A lot of them, so majority of them remain in the ocean or somewhere waiting to be recovered, and hopefully they don't break open. Um, Next slide, please. So you see the image on the left, the map, and that's the kind of extent of the disaster and the diffusion of the pellets and the extent to which they have been dispersed. It's gone all the way to Sri Lanka. The sinking unleashed, uh, you know the you know the state of Kerala declared this as a state-specific disaster, and it has also declared a 20 nautical mile fishing ban along the district. So this was a precaution due to the contamination fears. There were some initial oil sheens, so thousands of noodles are washing ashore in the beaches of Kerala, and this has become a most visible and persistent pollutant, the noodles itself. So as I mentioned, and by 27th of May, which is just 2 days after the sinking, beaches near the city of Trivandrum, which is also another big city in along the coast near Kochi, were blanketed with tiny noodles. What you saw, the images that you saw were from the immediate aftermath. And This is the first major noodle landing on Indian shores from a shipwreck of this kind. So, from the weeks following the spill, there have also been reports of several dolphins and even one whale washed up ashore. Now, they have been suspected to have probably died because of the exposure to toxins that I was talking about earlier, but no post-mortem reports are out yet, so we don't know what the cause of death is. But this certainly is a coincidence and coincides with the disaster itself. And that map you see is the map from the Indian National Center for Ocean Info. And this, as you can see, the nodules have spread beyond Kerala. And by early June, the currents carried them all the way to the neighboring state of Tamil Nadu, and then also the Gulf of Mannar towards Sri Lanka. So Gulf of Mannar is a biosphere reserve. It's an extremely ecologically sensitive region. So it's certainly a major concern with so much of this plastic washing up there. Next slide, please. And if you see this is the containers that were recovered along the coast of Kerala, and this is like several, as I said, a few dozen containers have been recovered. But most of them are still under water, and recovery efforts haven't started yet in full fledged because of the rough weather that we have now. Next slide, please. So, in terms of the impact on communities, the fisher folks have been the most affected. The Kerala's fish markets have suffered a severe crash as consumers are fearing contamination, and fishing communities have faced, the environmental damage, but also the livelihood losses have been for tens of thousands of fishermen have been unprecedented, and they've been barred from fishing. And the spills timing also has happened during a monsoon upwelling period, so to speak, and the productivity at this point peaks, and so there's a heightened risk of disruption because of this spill to the delicate ecosystem. So experts have been saying that the spill occurred, and the whole the monsoon driven winds that lift nutrient rich waters to the surface happens during this time. So this is the fish breeding season. Unfortunately, this could have long term effects. That means the whole spill could have had long term effects, which yet to probably notice them in the future, and they may not be immediately noticeable at this point. So, in terms of economic blow to the coastal communities, the 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 Kerala government has just announced like a very meager interim relief to about 78,000 fisher families who have been offered like 1,000 rupees, which is like roughly about $12 at this point, which is nowhere near sufficient for the losses that the community has suffered. And about 100,000 fishing families have been impacted and by this disaster. It's a rough estimate, of course. And fishing ban remains. It continues at this point, and we don't know we don't know how long the communities are going to be suffering because the fish consumption might be affected because of contamination worries. Next slide, please. So, in terms of accountability, we saw that there was delayed transparency in the critical first week, or the information that came out was scarce. The ship operators and the authorities did not fully disclose the cargo manifest and spill details. That came only after the High Court order on June 5th. And that once that was made public, we at least know what the ship was carrying, and this lack of transparency has hindered the trust that communities have on the cleanup efforts. So the company itself had not even communicated about this disaster weeks before after it happened. So that corporate accountability bit is a major concern when it comes to shipping disasters. And then there was a lack of preparedness. We had the initial response was very ad hoc, and rightly so, because none of the countries are in fact equipped to deal with this kind of a disaster, especially when it comes to nodal pollution. So local fishermen had and volunteers were left to hand save the nodals with sand. You can see an image there, completely ineffective given the scale of the crisis that we have. So this was a very slow process. Then we had the company itself. The case has exposed how global shipping companies use flags of convenience and complex ownership structures, which I'm sure other experts will talk a bit more about. But the court in this case called this a fraudulent device to frustrate claim enforcement, because when the case actually went to court, the company used this lack of jurisdiction and as expected as an excuse. And then there is insufficient compensation mechanisms. The incident also demonstrated that the challenges of getting full restitution for environmental damage, and like I said, at this point, fishermen have just gotten $12. We don't know how much and who should pay for it, because it's a taxpayer money that goes into compensation. Fishermen have to be paid for for the loss of the livelihood. So I think that remains a big concern. And we have the international conventions. We have the Oil Pollution Damage Fund under the IMO, which I'm hoping Amy will talk about a bit. But they exist in practice, but we don't have anything like that for for large scale pellet disasters. So also the efficacy of the oil pollution damage fund is also I'm uncertain. People I spoke to said that it's very hard to access. So that in that context, it remains extremely difficult to assess, to compensate the affected communities. And Sri Lanka disaster, of course, the Express Pearl disaster was a classic example, and the estimate damages from that was about in billions of dollars. I think some $6 billion or something, and ultimately, I think they could only recover less than $1 million. Then there's a issue of poor packaging of pellets, and this disaster wasn't just about the ship. It also reflected major failures in how plastic pellets were packaged and handled, and the spill, the sacks that we saw on the screen, earlier in earlier slides, were flimsy. They were single layered bags, which tore open, and when the containers toppled and submerged. So there is a major issue of accountability of the manufacturers of these pellets, and how they package this. So that remains a standing issue there. Next slide, please. So on the legal front, the on in July, in earlier this month, the High Court of Kerala ordered the arrest of MSC Aketita 2, which is another large container ship, which is sister vessel of the sunken ship, the Elsa, and which this Aketita is right now at is calling at the port of Virinjam, and it's there, but the court has attached that sister ship as collateral, and the court directed that the ship remain under arrest until the MSC Elsa deposits the $1.1 billion claim that has been made by the government of Kerala. And this ship, the sister ship, is a security until the state's compensation claims are met. And a majority of the claimed amount by the government of Kerala has been on for environmental damage, and the government has described the spill as the damage as incalculable and continuing. So the exact reasoning behind the calculation behind this number is mainly like it's an ongoing disaster. So a lot of it is also for livelihood losses, etc. So it's a huge amount, unprecedented. I think $1.1 billion. So the ship was arrested under the Indian laws, what they call the admiralty law, where a ship is considered a separate entity and can be held liable as a individual or as a person. So it's a very interesting application of law, and we'll see how that pans out in the future. But the company has pushed back against this claim. The initial hearings, the company's counsel argued that the Indian courts lack jurisdiction, and since the incident occurred outside the territorial waters of the country, and also they called the claim highly exaggerated, and asked for evidence of and reasoning behind the amount that was being claimed by the government. So of course, the court has rejected this, so the case will continue. We'll see how that pans out, and hope that there's some accountability there. Then my last slide, please. So in terms of the plastics treaty itself, and I'm sure other speakers will talk more about this. I won't go into details, but I think in the INC negotiations and the final stages of drafting the plastics treaty, and the incident in Kerala and Sri Lanka earlier, and the ones that we saw in UK, they underscore the urgent need for the global rules on plastic pellets and hazardous cargo like plastic pellets. So transboundary pollution, certainly, in cases like these, as we saw with the Kerala disaster, waters drifted the pellets all the way to Sri Lanka and other regions, and this exemplifies that marine plastic pollution is transboundary, and we need very, very robust rules to handle this kind of disasters. And no single country laws can fully contain such a damage. So this again goes into and bolsters the case for an international agreement like the Plastics Treaty, addresses pre-production plastics, or the nurdles basically. They are a critical part of the plastic life cycle. So I think that is a very important lesson from this disaster. And then we have to have a strong laws on that eliminate pellet loss, legally binding, target based, mm, pellet loss, across supply chain, standardized rules for packaging, and storage and handling. So I think that is also quite well established in this disaster, that we had very poor packaging, and the way companies transport these pellets across the world, are they just disasters waiting to happen. And then compensation claims, we need strict liability on that, and also verification and transparency, the mandatory third-party audits, and every compulsory reporting of all pellet losses and spills. And most importantly, we need to cap production and phase down virgin plastic production. So the treaty has to have a cap on productions if you're to see an end to these kind of disasters, a repeat of these disasters from happening. So I'll end there and pass it back to you, Jamie.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Dharmesh, for that really great overview of what's been going on in Kerala following the recent spill there. Really, really interesting to hear your insights on that. We'll quickly now move on to Amy, who will be taking us through why the UN Global Plastics Treaty is an important opportunity to reduce pollution. When you're ready, Amy.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you to FIDRA for having me once again. I think this is the 5th time that we've done this, and so hopefully y'all aren't too tired of hearing me talk about pellets in this treaty space. But also thank you to Dharmesh. That was a really important and sobering look into the spill in Kerala, and I think the number of pellets, individual pellets that spilled, is around 92.7 billion individual pellets. So although there's been some recovery, that when paired with those toxic pollutions is really scary and tragic. And I think that your presentation really underscored 2 key realities that I want to reiterate as critical. The first being that pellet spills, whether from chronic mishandling or acute catastrophic events like this MSC ELSA, are not anomalies, right? They're recurring and systemic, and they have long-term environmental and economic consequences, and that $12 figure is really crazy to me. Second, they reveal how ill-equipped our current systems are for response. So the legal and insurance frameworks in place definitely shield polluters from meaningful accountability. In the Kerala case, although they're pursuing that $1.1 billion in damages, the likelihood of recovering a fraction of the cleanup and compensation costs is really low due to limited liability regimes. And as you already mentioned, the flags of convenience that complicate jurisdiction. And that really makes it clear why the treaty must focus first on prevention, but then also on remediation, including resource scientifically grounded pollution response. And I'm also going to leave it to Falco to speak about how the treaty should use specific language to prevent and eliminate those pellet losses and pollution more generally across the entire life cycle. But I'm going to focus on what happens when things like this do go wrong. And first, I'm going to set the scene on where we are in negotiations. So next slide, please. So just for those who aren't engaged in this process, UNEA Resolution 514 gave us a clear mandate to conclude a legally binding instrument by the end of 2024. Since 2022, the INC process has been unfolding across 5 sessions, and by December of last year at INC 5, which is now 5.1 in Busan, we were meant to conclude the treaty, but due to a whole host of issues, including persistent divergence and political resistance from key petrochemical producing states, that obviously didn't happen. And because we're mandated to end there, rather than close the meeting, we just hit pause and we said, we'll pick this back up next year in Switzerland. Switzerland offered to host us in Geneva in August in 2 weeks for this second final negotiation. Next slide. And before I jump into remediation, I just want to share a few thoughts about what I expect in Geneva more generally. After 2.5 years of intense discussions, this has been a really incredibly fast negotiating timeline. And while it's important to get obligations done quickly to reduce the harm, it also means that we're unable to have some certain important substantive discussions. And that said, I think that there is a lot of movement towards finalizing an agreement in 2 weeks. So I expect a lot of intense negotiations, late nights, closed door compromises, kicking observers out of the process, and strong political pressure to finalize the text. Key issues remain unresolved, especially on production, chemicals, finance, and decision-making, but we're seeing growing convergence on core obligations across the life cycle, and that convergence includes a recognition of the downstream responses, which is releases and leakages, waste management, and remediation. And those are really necessary to deal with pollution and decades of accumulated pollution. So for us working on pellets and microplastics, Articles 7 and 9, which are considered the downstream, present a strategic opportunity and an area for optimism. Next slide. So currently, Articles 3 through 8 of the chair's text attempt to address the life cycle of plastics from production through the end-of-life treatment. However, even in a perfect world where we snap our fingers and the treaty prevents all plastic pollution going forward, we still have hundreds of millions of tons of plastic that already exist in the environment. A lot of it in aquatic systems, but also in illegal dump sites and everywhere. I think it's literally in every environment. Pellets are found in agriculture and in soil. Microplastics we know are in us as humans, so it's everywhere. So Article 9 has been given the name Existing Plastic Pollution. In a second, I'll talk about why that's really probably not the best legal language that we can use, but the point is that this article will cover what's in the environment and needs to be addressed through cleanup or monitoring or response, basically how countries respond when plastic pollution exists or disasters occur like just happened in India. Next slide, please. So here is the language from the chair's text, and you can see the outline of what they want to accomplish, right? The overarching aim here is remediation. They use slightly different framing with terms like environmentally sound removal and cleanup activities. So it's not perfect, but it's trying to address the right problem. First, it asks parties taking into account their national circumstances to identify and monitor areas affected by existing plastic pollution. These are referred to as locations or accumulation zones, and the idea is to understand where pollution has built up and needs attention. Then it asks countries to undertake removal measures framed as environmentally sound, including cleanup activities, both within its own jurisdiction, but also where appropriate in cooperation with others in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And that speaks to the kind of transboundary nature issue that Dharmesh just raised. Then it asks countries to undertake removal measures. And again, I think I just said that. So yeah, it does address the removal measures, but then it goes on about guidance adopted by the COP and best available science and relevant technologies related to those removal measures. And this is really important to take into account traditional and indigenous knowledge, which is also in Resolution 514 and is an important part of the mandate. There's mention here of engaging stakeholders, so that includes us, it includes local communities, scientists, and also the private sector. And that's in an effort to promote exchange of lessons learned. So I think that that's really relevant for what FIDRA does and the resources that Jamie will provide at the end. But I take a few issues with it. So next slide, please. I wanted to pause here and just signal that the chair's text does gesture in the right direction, but some of the terminology is too vague or too operationally narrow to deliver meaningful environmental outcomes, particularly when we're talking about microplastic and plastic pellets. So the term cleanup, it often conjures short-term cosmetic activities like beach cleanups or visible litter collection. And while those have some local value, they don't reflect the technical or ecological complexity involved in real environmental recovery. Similarly, the phrase accumulation zones implies pollution that's visible, contained, and easy to access. But many of us know that the most damaging forms of plastic pollution, like pellets, are not concentrated in this way. They're widespread, they're fragmented, submerged, and chemically active in the environment. And so that's why I strongly prefer the framing of remediation instead of cleanup. And also when we're talking about plastic pollution remediation, we exclude the word existing. And existing pollution puts a weird sort of time element on the text where it's legally unclear whether existing is existing at the time when the treaty enters into force or whether it could apply to future pollution. And remediation is really where harm is supposed to meet response. It's not just about taking the plastic out of the environment, it's about understanding what's there, assessing risks to ecosystems and communities, and then implementing site-specific strategies that actually work. And that might mean physical removal, but it could also mean habitat restoration, long-term monitoring, or containment. And a good example of that is in the aftermath of Express Pearl disaster, where we had a tech company send vacuum systems to Sri Lanka to help with the pellet recovery, but they never left the storage because they weren't viable for the conditions on the ground. And that's what happens, I think, when you treat pollution response as generic cleanup instead of science-based remediation. And when it comes specifically to pellets, I think that this sort of challenges the text in a way. Pellets are difficult to detect. They're hard to retrieve once they're lost. They don't stay put. They disperse. They degrade. They act as vectors for persistent organic pollutants and heavy metals, and they impact biodiversity and food chains. So the burden of the pollution overwhelmingly falls on the communities least responsible for its production: small-scale fishers, indigenous peoples, coastal villages, and resource-dependent populations who are already facing environmental and economic stress. So what the chair's text does give us that basic framework to identify, monitor, and remove plastic pollution. We need to push it a bit further. We need clear, strong language that moves beyond vague commitments. It recognizes the unique risks and characteristics of plastic pollution, embeds the principle of ecologically sensitive remediation, and ensures that when harm occurs, countries are not only allowed, but expected and supported in responding effectively. And it's not really about perfection at this point. It's about building a legal architecture that reflects the complexity of the problem and gives parties the tools and responsibility to act. Next slide, please. So this is an example of how pellets could be a primary contender for remediation. In the EU, where I'm based, it's estimated that 125,000 individual plastic pellets enter the environment every second. So these accumulate, and they're not just visible in hotspots, but across entire marine ecosystems, and they pose chemical and physical risks, as we've already heard. And we see here in Tarragona, Spain, a striking case where 1.8 million pellets were collected from just 200 square meters of beach in 2 hours. And that's not an accident. That is business as usual. It underscores why we need the treaty that includes post-release response, because that's where there's a lot of loss, and that happens from spills across from different companies. So I believe that Dow is there. We have local converters. We have Repso as well. And it all accumulates on the beach after rains. And so thanks to really great work done by local NGOs, Good Karma and Surfrider, the Spanish authorities are actually investigating the pollution and looking for some sort of remediation, but it highlights how producer-driven pollution is not just an accident, right? And Article 9 can identify different areas and create country responsibility to remove the pollution. But when they do, there's then that looming question, who is responsible and who pays for it? So next slide, please. Right now, basically, when a spill like the MSC Elsa occurs, it's not the companies that pay. And in Spain, it's not Repsol and Dow that are paying. It's a lot of times the local communities, it's the municipalities, it's the volunteers on the beach. So that's just basically unfair. It's a broken system. And the treaty has to correct this by embedding the polluter pays principle directly into remediation obligations. And we do that in Article 11. So next slide, please. Basically, as we think about how the treaty can support real-world responses on pellet pollution, the financing discussion under Article 11 is critical and relates directly to the activities that we want to see in Article 9. So what we at EIA and many countries are calling for is the creation of a remediation fund, which is a dedicated stream of financial support specifically for countries tackling pollution that's already in the environment. And this could be a game changer for responding to pellet and microplastic accumulation, especially in low capacity settings. This fund could support things like cleanup and response operations. It works well for chronic and acute pellet loss because it also could enable potentially rapid deployment when transboundary spills occur at sea. There's also technical assistance to help countries develop ecologically sound remediation plans and even ecosystem and livelihood restoration when damage has been done. And we believe that this fund should be industry financed, applying that polluter pays principle. One option is a polymer levy. Another is a fee-based model similar to that International Oil Pollution Compensation Fund that Dharmesh mentioned. And these models already exist, they work, and they ensure private sector contributes flow into public interest cleanup efforts. But even if the remediation fund doesn't deliver in practice for pellet-specific incidents, we believe that there are other options still available that could be established at a later date under Article 11. The treaty represents this great opportunity to have potentially a separate liability-based fund as well, one that activates when a spill occurs and ensures that the producers who are responsible contribute to a specific pool of funding. And there's no need to resolve every detail now. We have time in the future. We don't have to do it in 2 weeks. And we think that the diplomatic conference could lay out a process, just as it did with, for example, the Cali Fund under the Biodiversity Convention, to really finalize institutional design and explore additional tools, including how to operationalize that polluter pay mechanism in ways that reflect actual risk and responsibility. And in short, Article 11 really gives us that flexibility, right? We need to, at this stage, get enabling language into the treaty so that no country is left bearing the cost of that pollution alone, and so that future liability mechanisms remain on the table. So at this stage, we hope that countries really push forward to retain language explicitly calling for the establishment of a remediation fund in Article 11. That's the most appropriate place. We think that it's important not to keep it in Article 9, which is talking more about the needs for remediation, and that once the remediation fund is established, it's accessible, it's adequately resourced, and rooted in that principle. I think that that's it for me. Next slide. Yeah, I'll just end by saying that I completely agree with Dharmesh. Really, we need all of the measures that he recommended, and especially one that addresses the entire life cycle, which starts with production, because the more that we produce, the more that we ship them around the world, the more that incidents are going to occur. We've seen it over the last 5 years, and it's exponentially growing. So just emphasize that we need that, but hope that that addresses the remediation and finance component, and happy to answer questions at the end.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Amy. It was a really good in-depth look at the treaty text on those articles. If it's all right with everyone, we'll slightly overrun just so we can fit in a bit of a Q&A just by a couple of minutes, as there's been a lot of interesting stuff said so far. But if anyone needs to run, that is totally fine. I'll now introduce Falco to take us into some in-text recommendations.
Hi all, thanks Amy. So my presentation will be largely complementing those of Dharmesh and Amy, taking a bit more of a wider focus on where we are at with microplastics, including plastic pellets in the treaty negotiations so far, and that the importance really of prevention and upstream measures to effectively address this pollution at a global level. Can you go on the first slide, please, Amy? Next one, please. So just a tiny bit of background on microplastic pollution and why it's essential to address it. Well, basically, a huge quantity of microplastics enters the environment every year, with recent estimates suggesting of 12.7 million tons of microplastic entering the environment. And the problem with microplastics and plastic pellets in that case as well is that they are persistent, and once in the environment, they cannot effectively be removed. So consequently, they have been accumulating in the environments since humans started using plastics. And we now are aware with all the research that's been going on that microplastics contaminates every ecosystems, and they have been detected in a wide range of organisms with numerous studies demonstrating harmful effects, which is truly concerning and highlighting the urgent need of global action to mitigate this. But thanks to the increased understanding of microplastics and plastic pellets in the last 2 decades, this has been an important topic throughout the negotiations so far, with support from a majority of countries that action on microplastic is urgently needed. Next slide, please. But after 5 rounds of negotiations, where are we with the treaty in terms of addressing microplastics? Well, if we look at the chair's text from the latest round of negotiations in Busan, which now serves as the basis for negotiations, the word microplastics is currently mentioned 3 times. It's not much considering the importance of the topic, and there could definitely be more content with relation to it, but still there's a basis where we can work from. By the way, don't care too much about all the text on the slide. It's just to illustrate where microplastic is mentioned. So here on this slide, in the context of Article 3, known as plastic products, there's a mention of intentionally added microplastics. For those who might not know what we refer to with this term, this is basically microplastics deliberately manufactured and added to products for specific purposes, such as synthetic fertilizers, detergents. And yeah, this article can regulate this source of microplastics, which is a low-hanging fruit that the treaty can address at the international level. Next slide, please. Microplastics is also mentioned in Article 5 of the chair's text, known as plastic product design. In this case, this article is focusing on the design phase, so which is critical to ensuring safer and more sustainable use of plastics. So here, when it comes to microplastics, the logic is that their releases is limited during the product life. So making sure that microplastics emission is a key criteria of product design. So we know that microplastics are released throughout the plastics life cycle. So therefore, taking upstream action by addressing these releases from the design phase is really crucial to protect human and environmental health. Next slide. Yeah, microplastics are also mentioned in Article 7, releases and leakages. So here, this article is really essential for prevention, to eliminate releases and leakages of plastics, so including microplastics from all sources into the environment. It's really positive to see text on microplastic in this article, and it is really crucial that the text with pertinent microplastic is retained, basically because there are sources of microplastic emitted throughout the plastic life cycle. And this article really complements well and work hands in hand with other articles to ensure a holistic approach is taken to address microplastics. It's worth highlighting that microplastics pollution is linked with nearly every substantive provision of the treaty because microplastics are emitted at every stage of the plastic life cycle. And I will touch base on this shortly. Next slide. Now, if we consider our key topic of the day, so plastic pellets, and where it's currently addressed in the treaty text, well, as it stands, it's mentioned in Article 7, releases and leakages, as you can see on the slide. And at the moment, the text is quite high level. It's really positive to see dedicated text on plastic pellets, as it has the potential to set the path for future global measures to deal with this low-hanging fruit that the treaty can resolve. As other speaker mentioned, pellet loss being an entirely preventable form of pollution, which can easily be reduced by 95% with sound pellet loss prevention measures. By the way, there is a QR code on my slide, and this leads to a short 2-pager that we have put together, which describe these prevention measures in more detail, if you're interested in looking at this. And yeah, text on plastic pellets has been present in the various iterations of the treaty text in the start of the process. And there's a general agreement that the treaty can be an overarching framework to ensure that there is a harmonized and global approach on pellet loss prevention across land and at sea. The global nature of plastic pellet supply chains means we need dedicated governance at the global level to effectively end pellet pollution. And the development of dedicated measure on plastic pellet from the Plastics Treaty, so through this obligation, can really complement well other developing pellet policies, such as other work going on at the International Maritime Organization, for example, by ensuring consistency, transparency, and best practices across all sites, modes of transportation countries that will be party to the treaty. Next slide. Together with the recommendations that Amy have already mentioned, I'm just going to quickly give an overview of some high-level points pertaining to how the treaty can be made more effective to address specifically microplastics, including plastic pellets. So obviously, I've mentioned this already, but retaining the text that is pertinent to microplastic and pellets and strengthening it is really important to adequately fulfill the Resolution 514 mandate, so to address the full life cycle of plastic and end plastic pollution. It might seem obvious, but to be effective, interventions must be focused upstream and across the full life cycle of plastics. Upstream prevention are much more cost-effective and more feasible, as cleanup is nearly impossible and very costly. Specifically on plastic pellets, the treaty needs to action a series of complementary measures based on a true supply chain approach to bring about a systemic change in the way pellets are handled and transported on land and at sea. Supply chain approach basically means that every company, so regardless of their size, their location, across the whole plastic supply chain, is required to prevent pellet loss. Mandatory obligation on the whole supply chain will ensure that no individual company or sector is disadvantaged by behaving responsibly, and that would ensure consistency, transparency, and continuity in practices. Obviously, it's very important as well that the measures resulting from the treaty apply to all plastics, so regardless of the feedstocks, making sure plastic derived from fossil fuel, biomass, recycled content, or a combination of these all fall on the measures. And also, where evidence is limited but risk is high, the precautionary principle must be applied. Next slide, please. So here in this slide, that's a more detailed analysis of how the chair's text can be strengthened for microplastic and plastic pellets. But I'm conscious that we're running out of time, so I don't think I will dive into it and really describe much this. There is basically a QR code which links to a document which describes all of this. So if you're interested in diving in deeper in how this text can be strengthened, feel free to scan this. And if not, I think the table resumes pretty well what needs to be done. But specifically, when we look at plastic pellets and Article 7, it's really important that the language is strengthened to ensure that measures are taken across the plastic life cycle, so which would ensure that the article complements well other articles of the treaty and fulfill the objective of the UNEA 514 resolution. And also including mandatory minimum requirement for source of microplastic releases, including plastic pellets. Taking a life cycle approach and focusing on the prevention aspect, first of all, is key to strengthen the provisions which relates to microplastic and plastic pellets in this article. In the case of pellet, that would facilitate the implementation of that much needed supply chain approach, which I mentioned, having this at the international level. Next slide. This is my last slide, and it's basically to highlight the importance of different articles and their complementarity in effectively addressing microplastic and plastic pellet pollution. So it's a schematic from the Scientist Coalition for an Effective Plastics Treaty, which I find quite useful. It focuses on plastic more broadly, but it's applicable to the microplastic and plastic pellet context. And I touch base on some of the elements that Amy described as well. Basically, we can see in the middle Article 7, which is essential for microplastic and plastic pellet prevention. But to be effective and address releases across the full life cycle of plastic, this article needs to be considered alongside others from the chair text. So indeed, to effectively address microplastics, including pellets, upstream measures resulting from Article 3, 5, and 6 are essential. As described in my earlier slide, regulating identified sources of microplastic in Article 3 and addressing the releases of microplastic at the design phase in Article 5 would play a key role in reducing microplastics. And then quite obvious, and Amy's mentioned this, and Dharmesh as well, but obviously regulating plastic production through Article 6 would support all efforts to address all sources of microplastics. So with the logic that less plastic produced and used would mean less microplastics and plastic pellets. Aligning with waste hierarchy and circular economy ambition in Article 8 will also support efforts to tackle microplastic pollution. It's worth noting that waste management is a known source of microplastics, so it will be important as well to establish clear obligations for parties to address microplastic pollution from waste management processes. And obviously, an effective and just financial mechanisms, Article 11, focus on upstream measures that enable the development and implementation of provision will play an essential role. And that also links to what Amy has presented in her presentation. Also, having clear definitions, so through Article 2, will be essential to ensure common understanding and to reduce the potential for ambiguity and disagreement. While this reflection in my presentation is focusing on microplastics, it's also applicable in the context of plastic pollution more broadly, and the interlinkages and complementarity between articles will be key to effectively fulfill the UNEA Resolution 514 and end plastic pollution. Next slide. Yeah, that's my last slide. So thanks a lot. Sorry, running a bit over time, but yeah, if there are any questions, please feel free to ask.
No, that's great. Thanks for that overview there, Falco. And those text recommendations are very, very helpful. I'm going to very quickly, just show where you can find some of those resources. Just take a minute of your time, and then we'll go into the Q&A. So if you have any questions, please do share them in the chat as we go. So just to show you here, we have quite a few resources mentioned today. So first of all, there's a lot of information, obviously, on pellets and pellet pollution on the Great Global Nodal Hunt website. That is where you can find our map, which has the points around the world of where pellet pollution has been found, as well as more information on the solutions and the problem and how you can take part. We also have our information hub, which is a great source for resources on solutions, on evidence, education, and engaging with policymakers, as well as various images and other areas of multimedia. We also have our new INC 5.2 resources page, which will be continually updated with resources. On this page, you will find not just FIDRA resources, but those from other NGOs who are working on this area, as well as our asks, and we'll have this webinar linked to it as well. On that page, some of the resources you can find, we have our national and regional primers, which go into giving an overview of pellet pollution and the impact in various regions and nations. If yours isn't on there, we also have a editable version which you can update for your own nation or region if it's not covered. We also have the Microplastics 101 text recommendation document as recommended by Falco. Highly recommend that one, and for a deep dive into the text and the nitty-gritty of it. We then have evidence and engagement documents, so lots of evidence of pellet pollution around the world in our Mapping and Global Plastic Pellet Supply Chain report. Really good resource for the global issue and really getting into how the pellet supply chain and all its sources, as well as our annual Great Global Nodal Hunt reports. We also, if you're looking for more information on engaging with delegates and policymakers, we have our brief and our webinar from last year, which really helps give you ideas on where to get started at or the best way to go about it. And finally, we have our images and infographics in our media library. You are free to use these, just make sure that any images and infographics are credited appropriately. And these are a great resource for any work that you're doing on pellets. And as always, you can find out more on our websites and following us on social media. So with that, if it's all right with the panel, we will go into a very quick Q&A. So if anyone has any pressing questions, please feel free to add them in the chat, and we will just spend a couple of minutes on that. So far, so I will just get us started with going back to a point which I think was mentioned with Falco and discussing how everything's so interconnected, and that is the point of why reduction of production alone isn't a solution to stopping pellet pollution, why it needs to be more than just that is needed. I don't know who would like to take a stab at that.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. I think I'll just kick us off. But yeah, I think definitely, as we mentioned, having production reduction would be important, so to basically have less plastic being moved around, less plastic pellets, so then becoming more manageable. But what's urgently needed is mandatory measures to really regulate the way that pellets are handled across the entire supply chain. At the moment, I think it is what mentioned by speakers, there is a bit of a fragmented approach in the way that this is regulated. So there are largely voluntary guidance available, but we hope that with the EU regulation coming up and with the Plastics Treaty, there can then be a set of mandatory measures in place so that all handlers are able to reduce the loss of pellets at each stage of the supply chain, because there is evidence of losses, at all levels. So during production, during the preparing of material transport, during their transport, both on land and at sea. and also then during the conversion and plastic manufacturing stage. So we need basically a series of minimum. I would say, like, I often like to refer it as like minimum requirement that everyone has to meet in order to effectively prevent pellet loss. And then there's a document that might be interesting for some people to look at if you want to learn more about this. But I won't take all the time. Amy, I don't know if you want to add anything on this.
No, that was great, Falco.
Amazing. No, that was a great response. Thanks, Falco. We've had there's another question come in the chat. It's how does the treaty interact with other international agreements? Obviously, there's been some big steps from the EU since INC5, and how is there any insights on how that might further impact these discussions?
I'll have a go at that, and then Falco can jump in with anything I missed. But basically, the understanding right now of Article 7, which, as Falco outlined, like specifically addresses plastic pellet loss. Within that article and in the implementation, there is also language about giving consideration to existing relevant instruments. That means that this treaty can act kind of as a framework, because right now we see this fragmented approach. The IMO is trying to address maritime shipments by freight container by sea. The EU has taken measures across the entire life cycle. We have the voluntary measures that Falco just mentioned. And so the idea is the treaty would create an overarching obligation that then would be required to be implemented by each country. And in doing so, you would need to address the entire supply chain, but the IMO could take precedent and be the best area for shipping, for example, if it did come up with the mandatory measures that we're expecting in the coming years. And so it doesn't negate from the overarching obligation to eliminate, but it can complement each other, and they can work to fill the entire supply chain. And where there is binding measures and other instruments where the countries are parties to both agreements, they'll have to comply with both. And so if you're a member of the IMO and you're also a party to this new convention, if there's mandatory measures there, then you would have to apply those and whatever obligations you have that come out of Geneva negotiations. So they complement, they work together, and we're trying to avoid fragmentation by creating that overarching umbrella, which then other obligations could fall under.
Fantastic. No, it's a great overview of how that all fits together. Really nicely put. Brilliant. Is there if anyone has any other questions at all? Can see there's some really useful resources being put in the chat there as well. I highly recommend checking those out, as well as the resources we mentioned earlier on our info hub. And also, if there's any other questions coming to mind after this, please do reach out to us. Sorry, we have one question that's just come in. How can we assess the environmental impact of shipwreck-induced plastic pollution in economic terms?
Maybe I can go again first, and then Falco can complement. But it's really difficult, right? And it's difficult to put a number on it. Obviously, it's important for restoration and recovery and for giving just compensation to those directly impacted and affected. I think that Dharmesh did a really good job of outlining sort of the different players and stakeholders who are affected. And from there, the monetary cost is really difficult to assess, but certainly should include expected income and sort of go into a liability assessment and compensation assessment that you would see in other areas of law. The difficult part about that is that we don't have the long-term impact of pellet spills, especially these large disasters. I think people in Sri Lanka are still trying to assess what the long-term economic harm is. And because it is in a maritime environment, we don't have the impact long-term. And so that really limits the amount of recovery that's been issued before, and oftentimes shifts the economic cost onto the state to bear the burden, basically. And so, yeah, it's a really difficult assessment. I think that there are some elements that you can factor in, but at this stage, we don't really have the proper long-term assessment, nor do we have really the ability for other states that are impacted, the transboundary movement, to kind of recover from the ship. And the other last issue that I'll mention there is oftentimes now we're seeing that the producers of plastic are trying to put all of the liability onto the shippers. And so really, I think that there needs to be some conversation between the shipping industry and the plastic industry about who's really liable and who should pay when this pollution occurs. And certainly it should be, in my view, the producer of the material and the product, unless they're taking all the necessary steps to prevent it. And to date, I don't think that we've seen that. So yeah, a roundabout way of saying it's really difficult, but Falco probably has something else to add.
I think, Amy, thanks for a really comprehensive answer. I would just say that, yeah, we need more standardization in the way that we respond. In the case of spill, we know that at the moment there is no mandatory way of proceeding after a spill. So probably having measures either issued from the IMO that is currently looking at how to deal with this, and the Plastics Treaty and overarching framework can definitely support this as a way to respond, because often we see a lot in the case when a spill happened that the local communities are often the one impacted, and they're just not really having any clear information on what the process is going to be like. So also increasing that transparency element to make sure that in the case of a spill event like that, which impacts people's life, there needs to be official procedure, well communicated, and remediation for those affected. But yeah, assessing on an environmental perspective, as Amy highlighted, is quite tricky, and also that kind of linked to what Damesh was saying. I mean, just look at what happened with them, the spill. It happened, but weather conditions are making it really difficult to just go and retrieve and assess the environment at the minute. So that highlights as well, even though in this case it was a whole sinking of a ship, that prevention would always be more effective than any form of cleanup and remediation. But still, we need some standardized approach to dealing with this.
Amazing. No, thanks for that. It was a really good answer from you guys on that one. Really hit home how difficult it is when it comes to these issues, these complicated issues. But thank you to everyone all the speakers for today. Sorry we overran a little bit, but thank you for everyone who's bared with us and hung around. A recording of this webinar will be up on the FIDRA YouTube in the coming days, so you can go back and rewatch anything you missed. And encourage you to check out those resources, particularly like the 101 documents and the INC5 resource page. But with that, I will bring today's webinar to a close. Thank you to all the speakers for coming along and sharing their expertise, and thank you for all the people who participated in the audience. And yes, thank you. Everyone have a good day.